This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor Gregg the Electoral College, why we have it, the purposes it serves in our constitutional system, and also the political attacks that are repeatedly launched against the Electoral College. Professor Gregg is the director of the McConnell Center for Political Leadership at the University of Louisville. He has written and lectured widely on the Electoral College and the American presidency. He is the author of Securing Democracy, Why We Have an Electoral College, and also Thinking About the Presidency. Professor Gregg, welcome.
Well, thank you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Professor Gregg, I want to ask you a basic question from the beginning at the founding of our country. And those who vote to ratify the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention and also in the state ratifying conventions, in their minds, what is their sort of public intention regarding the Electoral College? Why? What are the arguments made in favor of it? Why do they think it is necessary for the president to be elected in this manner? And what are there arguments, say, by the anti-federalists that are made against the Electoral College?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. It's really an interesting story if you go back and look at the record of the Constitutional Convention. First thing to note is, put yourself back in 1787. They're creating an institution that is what we know as the American presidency that is really unique in American history. There's no good model out there for them to follow on creating this independent executive that is not a monarch, that is not a king, that is and has what they want, which I'll explain in a second, in the office holder. So there's really no model. They beat it around throughout the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia there, and asking this basic question: how do we get this person in this office that we want without it being a hereditary office? Throughout most of the summer, the number one plan is to have the legislature elect the president, which is stunning to most of us to think about today. But that's the default position. Have the executive there to execute the laws of the legislature, therefore somehow be beholden to the legislature, at least to some degree. Now, what they wanted was, it seems to me, is three basic things they were striving for. One is they wanted a president to be somehow popularly be grounded in the will of the people. That is, we call it Republican. So they wanted the executive to be Republican in some sort. Second, they wanted the president to have a degree of independence from other forces, so that the individual in the office could enact the office as they found best. And the third thing they wanted is they wanted the right quality person in the office. So let me call that virtue. Someone with the right qualities that would make them a great leader, a great president. So we have three things: Republican, independent, and have some degree of virtue. Now, those three don't necessarily go together. So, for instance, let's go to the default position at the Constitutional Convention is let the legislature decide. Well, we could argue that that's popular. It'd be hard in the 21st century for us to argue that, fuss about it, but the founding certainly, it's clear, is these people are elected either by their states in the Senate or by the people directly in the House, and they would elect the chief executive. So that has a degree of popularity that fits the Republican needs. On the third question, let's go to is the virtue. Would they likely have the right qualities that we would want as to be a great leader in the United States? And we could argue that would be the case. I mean, you have the American people electing the best and brightest, as assumption is, to be in Congress. So why wouldn't the men and women in Congress, or men, I guess, at the time, elect the best person for the office? But that third part that I mentioned, independence, becomes the problem. Because if you have the president elected by the legislature, how would you get the president to be independent? to really enact their will, to make the tough calls when it's unpopular in Congress, for instance, to use the veto power. To protect the Constitution, to protect the country against bad laws, etc. That becomes a sticky wicket. And how they answered it for most of the summer was to give the president a single 6-year or a single 6 or 7 year term. And what that meant was the president would serve for a fairly lengthy time, but would only have one shot at it. So you could argue that the office holder would not be beholden to Congress because Congress could never reelect them. But that had to go away as the evolution through the summer. That became problematic. The single term became problematic for lots of reasons we could talk about if you're interested. And that question of independence kept cropping up. And so the Electoral College system, well, there's a third system, we could say, is why didn't it let the people decide themselves? 2 members from Pennsylvania, Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson, both argued for a popular vote for president, direct popular vote. They were when it was completely out of the question. It wasn't even discussed as a serious issue when they brought it up. So nobody's seriously thinking about that. The Electoral College then becomes this compromise, this compromise where it has a basis in Republican thought, and that is the people in the states will decide a group of outstanding people to vote for a person for president. So those outstanding people would likely vote for the right person for the office, somebody of virtue. They would be Republican because it would be based in the popular sovereignty of expressed by the legislature in the states. And third, that person in office would then be independent because the Electoral College members would meet in a state, would vote, would disband, be never heard of again as a unit, and the president would then not be beholden to anyone for office. You figure 4 years later, it's going to be a new Electoral College in the states, that you can't buy them off, et cetera. So that's really where it comes from. It's this compromise. There's more to it than that. You have, if we talk about how the votes are allocated on the basis of state size and the states as a political unit, sovereign political unit in themselves. But that's where the compromise really comes from.
It's interesting you mentioned independence and the Electoral College, and thinking of current executive practice, current presidential practice, where independence doesn't really come to my mind. What comes to my mind is they represent. He's the only national representative. Something that you hear frequently, and we pay attention to the polls, the power that the president seems to wield over us and support that he seems to have. And we regard this as a good thing, as a defining feature of the president. But yet it seems that you're connecting the Electoral College to something different. What would they have meant by independence? Why would the Electoral College have served that?
Well, in particular, I mean, they really wanted the president to be, if you really take seriously the word I used before is virtue. They really wanted a president. I think it's clear when you read the Federalist, for instance, and you look at some of these debates. They wanted, and you look at the first person they put in the office, which is George Washington, is my favorite. They wanted a man who would be strong, independent, virtuous, who would have wisdom and knowledge to make the right decisions. And the part of the independence is they wanted to be independent really from 2 primary forces. Though we can extend that for sure logically, one is from the direct populace. The House of Representatives was to be the expression of sort of immediate popular will, elected every 2 years, elected directly by the people. That's the House is the natural institution created to be the vehicle for popular will. The president is not designed that way from the founders' perspective. The president's to stand above that all, be insulated is a good word to put this, insulated from the popular vote because of this independent body of the Electoral College. And it doesn't function that way today, but that's what it was intended. The other part of independence is independent from any standing body in politics. and particularly Congress, is if the president is given the power of veto, the veto power, and there, as Hamilton writes in the Federalist Papers, there are really two reasons for it. One is to protect the community against bad law, and the second is to protect his own office and the Constitution. He takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, to protect the Constitution from unconstitutional legislation. Well, the president can't do either one of those if 2 years into their term, the Congress passes an unconstitutional law, maybe that inhibits his power, maybe that inhibits, or that's just bad for the nation. If the president knows, well, 2 years from now, I'm going to have to go back to you guys and ask you for this reappointment. So that's really sort of what they had in mind with independence. It's the ability to stand above the other outside prevailing forces, and to make what they believe would be the best call for their constitutional office.
It's interesting as well in this period. I mean, we really don't have, if my understanding is correct, the type of executive in the states at this point that is similar to what they've done, what they've managed to cobble together at the Philadelphia Convention. I mean, you've mentioned these aspects of executive power. One can also argue it's unprecedented in America, it seems. And so the Electoral College would be important. Maybe you mentioned Republican rule, but there's also this phrase, and you see this in Jefferson's writings, of reasonable majorities. And the Electoral College, the concern is, one, to have some sort of majority aspect of it, but it's not a pure majority, at least in the way it is designed and how states are recorded votes and how one would campaign. Could you talk about that and this concern that it's not just that you want a majority behind the president, but the type of majority and how the Electoral College is connected to that?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right when you point to when I said earlier there's really no precedent. There is no precedent on the world stage for this kind of office, and there's no precedent within the states. The closest thing is the governor of New York, which is centralized into one office, and it kind of looks a little bit like the president. But you have other states like Pennsylvania is a good example, who had no executive at all, except for they had a committee, and the executive was made up of a committee because there's intense distrust of centralized power at the founding. And this goes to your point of majorities, because there's also an intense distrust of simple majoritarianism. And you see that throughout. You see that throughout the Federalist Papers. You also see that in a lot of the Anti-Federalist writings. What's really unique about what the founders attempted to do, and again, this is not how it has evolved in American history. Maybe unfortunately, maybe not. But they really wanted to create, let me call them deliberative majorities. And that is, if you think about let's start from the basics and move up to the presidency. Let's go through the system and look at the points with me where deliberation is supposed to occur, and deliberative majorities then are supposed to rule, and not simple emotional majorities. If you look at each state is given enough votes, their members to represent how many members they have in Congress, plus their 2 senators. So each state is given that number of votes, and they're allowed to decide. And here's a point of deliberation: the state is allowed to decide how they allocate those votes. The state legislature is allowed to. So the state legislature is then empowered to deliberate on that question. And they would, theoretically, before this sort of changed and democratized, the legislature would settle upon a system for selecting a core group of respected citizens in their state. Those respected citizens in their state would meet in the state capitol and deliberate, discuss, talk about the potential candidates. Perhaps some of them knew them in the Revolution or in some other national business or something, and they would have a discussion about those candidates. Those then, that's a very important point of deliberation. They would then cast their votes. Those votes would then be sent on to Washington or to the Capitol, where the where the Congress meets together, and the Vice President of the United States, as President of the Senate, counts the votes. If there's a majority, then in the Electoral College, then that person becomes president. The second person becomes vice president. We'll talk about that too, I suppose, the election of 1800 and how that changed. But if there is not, then the contingent election system sets in, which is more deliberation, and that is the House of Representatives is to choose the president, and the Senate is to choose the vice president. But how they've set it up is the House votes in state units. So the states are again important at that level, and deliberation is important. So, for instance, if you have six votes in the House, and you split three and three, you'd get no vote. And so you had to deliberate, you had to discuss within the caucus of the state. So those are little points, again, of more deliberation going on. And what do we know about these candidates, et cetera? The House or the Senate would act in a deliberative manner as the Senate as a whole body, and each senator would get one vote. So you can see along the way where I think the founders really wanted and attempted to set up pockets of discussion, deliberation, discourse, and different points where different perspectives are brought to bear on the decision that would ultimately end up, at the end of the day, with the president of the United States. One thing I didn't just to throw out is to connect those deliberative aspects. If you have the deliberation in the states, send the votes on to the House. And again, we have no majority. The House can't choose just anyone to be president. They have to take what came out of those deliberations in the states, and they have to pick one of the top three candidates. And the Senate has to pick one of the top two candidates for vice president. And so you can see this sort of bubbling up of deliberation there. And so you're absolutely right to say this is not simple majoritarianism. They wanted this slow, deliberative process of concurrent majorities, not simple majoritarianism.
It was interesting hearing you describe that. Are there examples from the early republic of state electors choosing against what the majority of the state had voted on?
Well, sure. There's, in fact, in the early votes, the states really the voters. Well, even to this day, let's start here. Even to this day, the American people don't technically have a constitutional right to vote directly for president or vice president. That's left up to the states, and we've democratized over the years, and every single state, by 1832 or so, they were almost all allowed the people to vote and then choose the electors in that manner, in a way that we sort of still do today. But in the early elections, there's no real statewide elections with votes and a national sort of popular vote, et cetera. It is really the state legislatures deciding in their own ways how to choose these people that will vote then for president.
This is interesting. I want to think, so how the Electoral College, in particular, it seems, given the powers that the president has assumed in the 20th century, or came to assume, the Electoral College becomes that much more important if you were to abolish it, because the constellation of changes that would cause would be so dramatic, because the presidency does truly touch upon so much now and affects so much. Those who wanted to move against the Electoral College, when does this begin? I mean, this is something, I mean, it's not, it seems to arise after there's a public controversy. So George Wallace's candidacy for the presidency, Bush v. Gore. Are most of the arguments to abolish the Electoral College and go to a one man, one vote, a majority rule system, does this really happen in the 20th century, or even does this precede?
It precedes the 20th century. It really heats up, with the progressive era and progressive reforms. et cetera. But it goes back to actually Andrew Jackson. After 1824, when Andrew Jackson, the Electoral College arguably keeps Andrew Jackson from winning the presidency in 1824. And so he starts a campaign against the Electoral College, which, of course, since we still have it, never succeeds. But it's part of his. It really starts with Jacksonian sort of democratic reforms, and never heats up too much during the 19th century. After the election of, for instance, 1876. Which is very controversial with Hayes and Tilden. You get some reform movements, but then it really does heat up with the progressive movement of the 20th century. The move toward primaries for the president, the move toward the direct election of senators, et cetera. It's the whole system that sort of begins sliding in the 20th century to direct Democratic majorities in control, and the presidency is the one that sort of stands out on that. It stands out, but it stands out on paper at least. But except for a very small, less than a handful of elections in American history, the winner of the popular vote arguably wins the Electoral College and becomes president as well. But it really is part of the 20th century reforms that are, and it is all, you're sort of pointing to, I think, this connection with power. And it really, part of it at least, is about power. It is about the movement in the 20th century to centralize power. Because if you get, and Woodrow Wilson is very clear on this. If you look at some of Wilson's writings on the presidency, he's very clear that the great hope of shutting down separation of powers, of this what he calls the Newtonian system of our government, and have a more dynamic, fluid, powerful federal government. The key to that is having a popular president who can whip the people into behind him and can use their power to, as he says, sort of lay a log across the separation of powers and checks and balances to get things done. So that is part of it. You have some other movements of just people that just good government or want to let the people decide kind of arguments, but that is certainly part of it, is this quest for power.
In terms of the presidency standing out, I mean, state government, principles of representation in state governments have to be one man, one vote. We have direct election of senators, so we moved away from the states appointing the senators. Certainly, one man, one vote seems to be some sort of moral principle now. Majorities, the way we think about presidential powers in terms of majority popular opinion approval. What would we lose if we were to abolish the Electoral College? Could you just do it and nothing really change? Is that a likely eventuality, or are there a lot of consequences that would result that never really get discussed when we talk about this?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of consequences. It'll take a while to untangle all of them. But let me start by saying that I think it's I don't concede the point that the Electoral College violates one man, one vote principles any more than the United States Senate does. I mean, if you look at the United States Senate, a small little state like, let's say, Vermont, has equal representation, and those small number of people that live in Vermont have the same amount of representation as the many times its size the people of California. That violates equal representation in the federal government. And the presidency just follows that principle because the presidency gives the Electoral College, gives to the states an equal number of representation, no matter how big or how small. So it doesn't violate it any more than the Senate does, I think. And the second part of that is that they are each of our elections is democratic, is one man, one vote, is majoritarian at the state level. So in Ohio, you have a Democratic race for the presidency. In Virginia, you have a Democratic race for the presidency. In Indiana, where you are right now, you have a Democratic race for the presidency. We just happen to count the votes by states rather than counting them all up and a simple national plurality. If we were to start going down the list of how this would change our system, what kind of changes would come about? Let's just start with let's go to the 2000 race, Bush v. Gore in 2000, and I had a senior Democrat senator visiting my McConnell Center that I run here at the University of Louisville a week after the election in 2000, when we didn't know who the president was going to be, because of course it was all bogged down in those three, I think it was, counties in Florida with the hanging chads and all that ugliness. And I said to him, I said, Senator, I said, I suppose you're really going to oppose the Electoral College now after this mess. And he stopped and he said, heavens no. He said, this is a reason why we have the Electoral College, which shocked me. And what he said was, he said, just imagine what we would be today without the Electoral College. And that is an election this close, separated by a few 100,000 votes across the country. We would be fighting this out with lawyers in every precinct, in every district, in every county, in every state of the country, with the hopes of getting, being able to steal a few votes there, disqualify a few votes here, find a box of votes over there. It would be a national nightmare. A close election would become instantly a national nightmare of recounts, lawsuits, real serious problems, and I think undermine the rule of law.
One could imagine the 1960 election.
Absolutely. The election would be a great example.
So you would say the Electoral College actually isolates those who would perpetrate voter fraud. I mean, even if you could accomplish it in one state and you're successful, does it really affect the outcome of the race?
Unless it's very close and it comes down to that one state. But then the good news about it is we'll fight this out in the one state. And the lawyers will be in the one state, the courts will be in the one state. We won't be doing this all across the country. It centralizes, it reins in the potential of voter fraud, of the potential of all the lawsuits and et cetera in a close election.
Going back to what we started with in the beginning of, and just thinking about principles that have carried forward. One being reasonable majorities. It seems obviously it would shape the way you campaign and the way you try and put together 270 electoral votes is very different than if you're just worried about a majority vote. In that regard. And also, something that I've thought about is how do minority interests seek representation in an alternative system? I don't know if you've thought about that, but it seems a minority interest within a party that tries to secure election for its candidate in Electoral College, that minorities or minority interests act very differently than they would in a pure majoritarian system.
Absolutely right. We have to keep this in mind. So you're taking us to how do we campaign now, and what about minority rights? You have got to keep in mind that all of our elections are fought on the according to the rules of the Electoral College. The 2012 election we're in right now is being fought over the rules of with the rules of the Electoral College. Our campaign going to look different. So even in 2000, we say Gore won the national popular vote. Well, yes, he did, but he won according to the rules of the game fought out according to the attempt to win the Electoral College votes. If that would have been different rules, maybe Bush would have won the popular vote in 2000. So you can't. It's apples and oranges potential here, because things change dramatically. Here's how it will change. If you abolish the Electoral College, I fully assume this is what will happen in the campaigns of the future. No candidate, particularly no Democratic candidate for sure, but probably no candidate ever again visits someplace like West Virginia, or someplace like rural Ohio, or someplace like North Carolina, or someplace like Colorado or Iowa, because the name of the game is simply to win one more vote than your opponent. And where the votes are in Chicago and San Diego and San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York and Philadelphia and the suburbs around them. And so what you would see is, I think you can imagine a candidate Obama in 2008 unleashed from the Electoral College and those the Pennsylvanians clinging to their guns and God, et cetera. And imagine his campaign where it's simply focused on maximizing voter turnout in major urban areas and their surrounding suburbs. I think our elections changed dramatically. And what happens to particular minority interests of rural communities it would be of interest here, where in today's system, rural communities have some kind of a shot to matter. In a system where you just go vote one vote, you just count up the votes across the country. I think rural voters, rural values, just don't matter anymore. And I think that will lead to a really polarized American political system, more radical policies at the presidential level, a sort of a one where we have the Electoral College gives us a fairly balanced battle where the Republicans and Democrats are fairly balanced every year coming into this. We got a fair shot of winning it on both sides, to a system that is skewed considerably to the left, and where the particularly more liberal Democrats will have a much better chance of winning than Republicans, and particularly conservative Republicans. And frankly, that's what's behind at least some of the movement, not everyone, but a considerable part of the movement for the abolition of the Electoral College by people like George Soros, who has funded some efforts on this. It's because they know this is a way to move the whole political balance of the country to the left.
Yeah, it's certainly widespread observations of what happens in state governments after state senates are no longer allowed to weight of representation by rural areas or less populous areas. You do seem to get the cities seem to dominate state governments considerably more so than they would have. And I was going to ask you, with the minority interest too, I mean, your incentives would be, I think, you want to stop a majority. It seems you can make the argument you want to stop a majority from easily forming that would not necessarily represent you. So you form splinter parties. And you could have 4 or 5 parties instead of a 2-party system, with all of which designed to force your point of view to be represented in some way. But of course, that leads to a much more aggressive, polarized politics, which seems, I guess, somewhat funny to say. We are fairly polarized now. But if you look at, say, the French presidential elections, that's a different animal than what we have in thinking of, say, the types of parties that form and seek to shove their way in. Also, there's would it actually be a majority vote? I mean, I suppose you really wouldn't get 50.01%. You would probably get more like 40%, and I guess you have a runoff. So that's that of course plays into this. I mean, our party system, 2-party system. So you don't have 2 parties, but you wouldn't have the current importance of the parties, I think, and the way they are cobbled together, locally, state, national. It seems you would have a different party system after you abolish the Electoral College. And also that kind of raises into question, what would it do to the states?
Right. There's a lot there. I think your point is to absolutely a fundamental change in our system that would occur, and that is we are a 2-party system. We think of that's natural in America. It's probably really not natural. It probably is the result of the Electoral College and the way we count votes, and that is the states, all except Maine and Nebraska, have decided that they're going to follow the unit rule, and so. In order to count in the Electoral College at all, you have to win entire states. Otherwise, you can't. You don't count. We don't have proportional representation or anything like it. So we have the unit rule, which forces what is probably a naturally 4-party system in America. We probably have naturally a conservative party, a moderate right party, a moderate left party, and a farther left liberal party. And you can think of it in the 2008 race is pretty clear on this. You probably have a Barack Obama party and a Hillary Clinton party and a John McCain party and who was more conservative ran in 2008.
Rick Santorum party.
A Rex Santorum party, thank you. That'd be good. A Rex Santorum party. So you probably have naturally four parties, and that's but because we need to fight over winning entire states, there's a natural incentive for the two sides on the right to form a coalition and get behind somebody like a Romney right now. And there is the natural tendency, not natural, but is a forced tendency on the left to gather around and forget our differences because we have to win entire states. You throw that off and you say whoever wins the most votes across the nation, you're going to see, I think, this splintering of the conservatives saying I'm not getting on board with this more moderate Republican, or the moderates not getting on board with the more conservative Republican nominee, et cetera. And you're going to see a splintering of the parties probably into four candidates back like it was in 1824, for instance, and what that's going to mean is a number of things, but it's going to mean an empowering of fringe candidates, particularly because you have the four of the main party, but then you have the Green Party pop up, and you have the Libertarians pop up and be more serious because the wasting vote sort of thing won't be happening. And they'll become, like you're talking about European elections, become power brokers. I don't think we would necessarily want that in America. Though I'm frustrated often by how slow things are, and I'm frustrated by the moderation in our politics sometimes. It doesn't do what we know we need to get done. However, that stability is probably a virtue in our politics, and I don't think we want to throw it off too easily. You also have that problem that you're pointing to is these won't be majority elections anymore. Remember back when we had in 1992 with three candidates in the race, Bill Clinton won 43% of the popular vote. Well, okay, so that means 57% of the American people voted against Bill Clinton. Do we want a president that 60% of the American people vote against? How about 65% of the American people vote against? Do we want, how low are we? It's sort of like the Jamaican limbo dance here of politics. How low are we going to go? And most serious observers of this that are really serious about reform of the Electoral College are really for it. They know what the result is, and that result has to be a runoff election. They know it. Some of the ones who are advocating for it and don't want us to know that won't say it, but the real serious ones that are really in it because they believe it's the best for the country, they provide runoff elections. So when the top two candidates, they're both under 40%, well, then we'll have another election. I don't think any of us want to go through this all again after these are over. So I think that's, again, another really a bad consequence of the abolition of the Electoral College.
It's interesting listening to you kind of tick off our major cities and how your strategy would be to turn out, and that would be where you would focus your efforts. Seems to me it raises much more so than now the role of the media. And the role of mass media, traditional media, as opposed to you think of a candidate, you obviously aren't going to spend your summer in Iowa preceding the campaign, trying to gin up support before the Iowa caucus. You're going to be doing a lot of TV interviews, which kind of a further centralizing effect. It would seem to me on the presidential race. So I guess maybe in conclusion. Electoral College not discussed that much, although there was, or in terms of attempts to move opinion against it currently. But after the 2000 election, there was a lot. Hillary Clinton introduced an amendment. There was, interesting the way the Gore campaign appealed to kind of automatically they should win Florida because they won the popular vote. This was kind of a moral argument about democracy that they made, and there was a lot of legal scholarship that arose after the 2000 election. I remember reading several attempts to really link the Electoral College to the southern states in the founding, that this was actually a morally tainted piece of the Constitution as well. So I guess maybe we can end with that. Where are things now in this debate?
You're absolutely right. Let me say one quick thing. You're talking about how the campaigns would change and the role of the media. Let's face it. What matters is media coverage, money, and votes. And if you set up a world where the big money all comes from the cities, The media is all controlled by people in major cities, and the votes are all in major cities. You're aligning all the power there, and I think that's something really seriously to think through. Your listeners need to know sort of where we are in play this and be aware of it right now, because the action has shifted from Washington, from the national debate, and really there is no national debate now, and it's partly because after 2000, when people really seriously looked at it, I think they came to the conclusion that the Electoral College saved us in 2000 from a kind of a nightmare that would have been occurred otherwise. And so that's not happening. No constitutional amendment is coming forward in any serious way. The opponents have moved now to working sort of quietly state by state. And the debates, that's where the debates are occurring. If it's really debates at all, it's just sort of getting pushed through. And it's a plan called the National Popular Vote Plan, the NPV, National Popular Vote. It was set up by a Stanford computer professor who created the the instant lottery tickets, rub-off instant lottery tickets. So that's where his money comes from. And he set up the scheme where he said, let's go state by state and get state legislatures to pass laws that say whoever wins the national popular vote gets our Electoral College votes. And it kicks in whenever enough states to equal a majority, that's 270 electoral votes, pass similar legislation or the same legislation. So that's where it is right now. They're using the state powers to choose any way they want who will get their Electoral College votes, and this has happened now. I think it's in 9 states that it's passed, including the biggest state is California, and so the people of the legislature of California has said, no matter how our people vote, whenever 270 enough states to equal 270 electoral votes pass the same legislation, we will give all of our votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. So it's passed 9 states, I think it is, worth 132 electoral votes. They're halfway there, almost halfway there, to achieving that goal. And it's happening. The scary thing for me is it's happening without really serious debate, without serious engagement. People don't know it's happening, and it's only happening in pretty strongly blue states right now. But it is moving. They have more than 2,000 state representatives that have signed on to this program, and the problem is with it is really not. There's no serious debate. So I think a lot of these folks are signing on, but without seriously thinking through the consequences, like we did today in this podcast. That's where we are right now.
I can only imagine. I mean, given the lack of public debate, what would happen if California had to, in effect, send its Electoral College votes in favor of a Republican,
right?
Or Alabama in favor of a Democrat. I mean, that would just be. I mean, the public outcry would just be bizarre. I mean, I think people would be very confused.
I think
not
you're
enraged.
Right.
Yeah. Professor Gregg, thank you for being here and discussing this. This was great.
No, this is very important and great fun. Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.